Hey, hey, House of Health. It has been a minute. Okay, so I have something exciting that I want to share with you today. If you have been a follower of the Wealth Witch podcast or House of Wealth or House of Health and all the many iterations that this podcast has gone through, you know that I've always really been passionate about helping people take control of their lives, of their well-being. This podcast has certainly gone through an evolution of all things from New Age and wealth consciousness work to, my journey and struggles with my health and returning home to a more traditional faith path. I've shared a little bit of everything on this podcast over the years. But there's another conversation that I've really been wanting to have. And it's one that dives deep into the culture that we're currently living in. And it's a conversation that talks about how that culture shapes us. And more importantly, it's an exploration of how faith and belief in God can really help us to stand firm in truth while we navigate all of it. And so that is why I have launched my brand new podcast, which is called The Culture Cast. And this show is all about really bridging modern culture with God's kingdom and breaking down cultural narratives and challenging the status quo and still continuing to question everything as I've always done. And it's really about having real, unfiltered conversations about faith, about politics, about the world we live in, about the media, about the entertainment industry. It's controversial. It is confrontational. Those things about me definitely haven't changed. And I'd love for you to check it out. So in just a moment, I'm going to play a short snippet from the first episode of the podcast so you can get a taste for what's coming and what we're doing over there. And if you're ready for bold, faith-filled conversations, please make sure to subscribe to the Culture Cast. Go check it out. I will put a link in the show notes. We're going to play just a brief part of the episode. And if you want to listen to the whole thing, you can definitely head over to the Culture Cast and listen to it. There are several other really thought-provoking conversations up there already. I hope you enjoy it. Now, here is a preview of episode 1. Hello, and welcome to the Culture Cast. I am your host, Leah Steele, former witch and New Age disciple who is now on fire for Jesus and committed to dismantling New Age deception, as well as far left political propaganda and narratives that I really feel like are really degrading the foundation of not just Western culture, but culture all around the world. So this podcast, I've had so much resistance to starting this. I am so excited about it, but I know that in deciding to put this out there in the world, I am opening up a huge can of worms for myself. I have been a prominent figure in the online wealth consciousness coaching space since about 2016. Some of you may have followed my previous podcasts. The Wealth Witch podcast was one, and then House of Wealth that ultimately underwent a rebrand to House of Health. And I really was kind of planning to continue on with that House of Health podcast and share my passion for health politics, health, longevity, wellness, and the culture that kind of surrounds all of those things. But as I, leaned into doing that rebrand and launching that podcast, it just became more and more clear to me that what I was really being called to do was to create a podcast where I could speak about culture. So I was saved on July 1st of 2023. And it almost is surreal for me to even sit here and be saying this on a podcast that I was saved, because I was always that person that didn't want to be coined or termed a Jesus lover. I didn't want to be one of those wacky evangelist, Jesus loving, preaching people. And here I am. So I want to tell you a little bit about my story today. But before I do that, I really want to tell you what this podcast is going to be about and what you can expect going forward. So the Culture Cast, the idea behind this podcast is I really wanted to have a place where I could come and talk about how New Age deception is actually shaping the political landscape of the planet, but also really shaping the social narratives that are degrading humanity. And I wanted to be able to talk about politics, and I wanted to be able to talk about current events through the lens of somebody who has had the veil lifted and sees things from such a different perspective. There is a huge revival happening on the planet right now, and people are coming home to God, and people are, opening their hearts to Christ. And I think it's so important to have a place to actually talk about that, but also to talk about what happens when you start to become Christ curious. What happens when the veil starts to be lifted? What happens when you're deep in the New Age and you start to realize that perhaps it isn't working the way you've always been told it should work? And I come to you with this podcast, not as somebody who was just in New Age, and then, became saved. I come to you as somebody who was deep in the occult, not just from a academic perspective, though certainly I have a deep passion for studying all things religion and theology, and the occult was no different when I was a part of that. So I definitely would consider myself a student of the occult, but I wasn't just a student. I was practicing, and I was deep in the occult, deeper than probably most people that were around me even realized that I was. Everything from practicing voodoo to, eventually being initiated into a African spirituality practice, and having my children initiated. I was deep in it. And so, for me, one of the things that I know is that to bring this podcast forward, I have to be very honest and transparent about my journey, about where I was. And I need to share all of that with you. And so I will be doing that as we move through this podcast. I hope you're enjoying the episode. For the complete episode and to listen to more episodes of the Culture Cast, click the link in the show notes or simply search the Culture Cast into whatever application you are listening to this podcast in. Go over, listen to episode 1. I would love your feedback. So if you are inclined, feel free to email me at podcast@theleahsteele.com. Let me know what you think, and enjoy the show.